Hello, I'm Peter Russell, and I'd like to welcome you to this second program in our series of 5 programs, in which we're looking at the significance of the times we're passing through and what they actually mean for each of us in our own lives. In the first program, we looked very much at what was happening in the external world, the accelerating pace of change, and also the environmental crisis, and saw that this had many implications for ourselves in terms of creativity, how we manage stress, our values, these sorts of things. In this second program, we want to focus a lot more on creativity itself. We'll be looking at what is creativity and what are some of the things we can do to actually increase the creativity in our lives. And as before, I'm joined in the studio for our discussion by Matea, Tony, Vida, and Jerry. And I think to start with, I'd like to put a question to you, which is, what comes to mind when you just hear the word creativity? What do you think of? What are the first words that come to mind when you think of creativity? What does it mean to you? Vida?
Well, I would say finding paths, new paths that are not walked in yet, whether that's maybe in defining problems, solving problems, or just creating something.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Jerry?
I'd say finding a unique solution to a problem is probably one of the most important parts of creativity. Mm-hmm. Or somehow combining things that are unrelated together, or things that have little value, and making something much more valuable.
Mm-hmm. Matea?
I'd say no limits, not setting up limits on our process.
Mm-hmm. For you, Tony?
For me, what's really the first thing that comes to my mind about creativity is not what it is, but something about it, and that is that creativity is something worth worshipping. Mm-hmm. And next thing then is the definition about what it is.
Right. And what would you say it was for you?
Well, it's very difficult to say what it is. Let's say that I would probably be able to recognize a creative person.
Right, okay. I think what is interesting about this, and what 3 of you said, is that we commonly think of it as something new, as coming up with a new idea, a new insight. But I think what we sometimes overlook is that the coming up of a new idea is only part of the creative process. I mean, some of the people we would recognize as great creative people, maybe Leonardo or Einstein, those people. What we see is the idea. With Einstein, we see the theory of relativity, a wonderful creative idea. But what we don't always see, I think, is the process that goes into that, and that we just see that aha, that moment of insight. But Einstein, we know, spent years working on the problem until he had the aha, and spent a long time afterwards formulating that in the mathematics. I think the same with great artists. You find they spend a lot of time thinking about what they're doing, and then suddenly the insight comes, and then there's that whole thing of working it out in practice. And so I like to think of creativity as more than just the having of the new idea, which is the central part of it, but all that goes into the having of the idea and what comes out of it. And I like to look at the stages we go through. And to do this, I'd like to actually give you a little problem. It's a very simple problem. It's sort of almost an everyday problem, but it's a difficult one, and it's the difficulty which brings out what we go through. And the problem is this. Just imagine that you were given a cake, an ordinary cake, and you were told you had to cut it into 8 pieces of exactly the same shape and same size, exactly the same, equal pieces. However, the problem is you are only allowed to use the knife 3 times. So how would you do it? Only allowing 3 cuts of the knife. Now, it's not an easy problem to solve, and probably what's going on in your mind, and maybe people at home are listening, is you start thinking about how you might do it. You do it this way and that way, and you've got 4, but then you're stuck. And this is the first stage that often happens, is actually defining the problem, trying out solutions, seeing what might happen. Can any of you see a solution to it?
You said 3 times?
3 times.
3 straight cuts, I say.
3 straight cuts, absolutely straight. See, what's happening is, although I haven't said it, everybody brings an assumption to the problem, and that is you're looking down on the cake.
Yeah.
It's 2-dimensional. In fact, a cake is 3-dimensional.
Yeah.
What happens? You see a solution when you realize that?
Yeah, first you cut it horizontally.
Yes. That's what we forget. We can also cut a cake that way. If you cut a cake that way, and that way, and that way, then it's easy. But we have this assumption, which nobody said, but you can only cut it from the top. Or sometimes another assumption we have is that you can't move the pieces around. Another way of solving it would be to cut it into 4 pieces and then move them out into a straight line and do one cut across all 4. But that's one of the things that happens in the creative process, is the assumptions that hold us back. And this happens, I think, all through life. We get stuck with assumptions. And part of creativity is how to step back from our assumptions so that we can actually begin to see things we hadn't seen before.
What I thought is, what is very important in the process is that you know in advance that there is a solution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this motivation, there is a solution, I only need to find it.
Yes. But when you can't find a solution, often what happens is we move into a stage of the creative process which is frustration, which is when I feel I can't do it, and what we tend to say then is either there is no solution, it can't be done, or I'm not good enough. And this is actually a stage of the creative process. This is often recognized as the second stage. The first stage is thinking about the problem, trying things out, seeing what might work, what doesn't work. And if you don't come to a solution, you then become frustrated. And we don't think of frustration as creativity. We think of creativity as having this new, bright idea. And frustration is like, I'm stuck, nothing's happening, I'm no good. But that's nearly always part of the creative process, and you can use it as a sign that you need to stop and step back and look at your assumptions. Then another stage, which doesn't really happen here in the studio, which is called incubation, which is when you're doing nothing, which is very important. And when do you have your ideas, your creative ideas? Typically, where are you when you have a good idea, creative idea? What sort of situations? Walking?
Mostly doing some kind of sport.
Doing sport, yep.
And some other kind of like manual preoccupation with my hands, like domestic work.
Where would you say, Jerry?
Reading, probably.
Reading. What's interesting is these are very seldom times when we're actually at work thinking about the problem. I mean, other people say in the bath or shower or walking the dog, these sorts of things. And that's because often we need to do a certain amount of work thinking about the problem. And then there's times when we need to stop thinking altogether. Very often people wake up with ideas in the middle of the night when they completely stop thinking about the problem. And this is the phase of incubation, which I think we also need to value, because we think the harder we think about a problem, we're going to come to a solution. But our experience of life tells us the opposite. It's when we stop thinking about a problem that the solution comes up.
So you think that's the heaviest part in the process of creativity?
No, it's all, I think the heaviest part is dealing with the frustration, but I think we don't value the incubation. If you came into an office and saw somebody sitting there with their feet up on the desk, you'd say they're not working very hard. They may be just allowing the ideas to come through. We think the harder you work, the better the ideas, but I think it's often the opposite. It's learning to stop at times. We need to think, we need to analyze the problem, and then the times when we need to stop analysing and rest, and like we say, sleep on it, take a break. And that's allowing the unconscious to come up with the idea. And then you have the insight, the aha. But in my experience, probably 80-90% of the insights come when you're not trying, when you've stopped trying to come to a solution, when you're probably doing something completely different.
So that's inner knowing, intuition?
Yes, you could say that. It's interesting, the root of intuition is teaching knowledge that comes from the inside, it comes from our unconscious. And I see the process of creativity as we're taking in ideas, giving them over to the mind, and then something happens which is completely mysterious, out of which some new idea comes. And then there's the final stage, which is taking that idea and putting it into practice, into one's life.
So could we say that if we follow our inner world, intuition, and add the ratio, that's the best possibility we could get?
If we followed our intuition?
Yes, and used our mind, our rational mind, how to achieve it. I mean,
yes.
with the thinking before, not the other way around. Following, intuition could be wrong or not, or what is your...
You need to test it, yes. I think we need both. We need the rational analysis to analyze a situation, whether it's a problem in our own life or on a global level. We need to think about it very clearly. But there comes a time when we also need to stop thinking to allow the intuition to take over. And then you need to, again, think very clearly about the ideas you have. Do they make sense? Do they actually work? Maybe there's things you haven't seen. Because sometimes the ideas don't work. I mean, the classic case of this probably was Edison designing the light bulb. I think he designed hundreds of different light bulbs until he found one that worked. Each one was a new idea, a great piece of creativity, and he tested it, didn't work, back to the drawing board, another idea, tested again, didn't work, and he went on and on and on until he finally got a light bulb that really worked. But I think another important thing to see about the process is it isn't just those moments of designing a light bulb or thinking about the theory of relativity or doing a work of art. I think creativity is something that happens all through our lives. I mean, even now, speaking. I have an idea, I want to put it in words. These aren't sentences I've spoken before, I don't think, but I'm creating words to express my ideas, and the actual practice is saying it. There's a creative process happening there, which is maybe happening in seconds rather than days, but it's that same process, the same process when you cook a meal or plan a vacation.
Yeah, I must say that I agree very much that too often this concept of creativity is limited to solving problems, that you're presented with a problem. But the way I see it, it's much more open. It's, as you're saying, a process that may be ongoing, or it may be just finding problems sort of out of the blue that didn't exist. Like I think the person who came up with the example of the cake had a very creative idea coming up with the problem for others to solve. So,
yeah, I think this is important. Is to see it as something. I think it's part of our thinking, really. To be alive, to think, is to be creative. And I think one of the ways we stop our creativity is by seeing that it's just something out there that a few people have, or at odd moments I'm creative. But I think if we begin to realize we are creative the whole time, then we can begin to ask, how can I be more creative or use it in better directions? Jerry?
You mentioned just asking a question now, and I've often thought that creativity is a process of asking yourself the right questions to come to the right solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. It can be something you're trying to just do. You're asking yourself, how can I do this better for myself? Or how can I do it better for everyone? Even though there's not really a problem, you have an aim or a goal in mind.
Yeah. And I think using the word problem again limits us. It makes it like too much of a hard thing. It's just working our way through life. We're needing creativity all the time, just to make decisions about what we do. Let's say even simple things. Cooking a meal is a creative process. The problem is we don't see it as such.
You distinguish, though, between the different types of creativity, such as artistic creativity or scientific discovery or comic inspiration, that there's some different process going on for each, or is it one underlying process involved in all?
I think the underlying process is the same. It's interesting. I mean, Arthur Koestler, I know you know, talked about this, and in fact, he said the artistic creativity is the ah, the scientific is the aha, and the sort of more comic creativity, the joke, is the ha-ha. Right. That was, I think, his joke about creativity. What he showed, though, was that underlying all creativity was one common thing, which was the bringing together of two ideas or visions which hadn't been brought together before. So a scientist coming up with a new theory, for example, Einstein put together certain things he was thinking about with light, with certain experiments that had been performed. He managed to fit those together in a new way, and out of that came the theory of relativity. So in science, it's putting ideas together in a new way. And what Arthur Koestler tried to show is in art, it's the same thing, putting ideas or themes together. You're producing something new out of existing things. And the same thing is true with a joke. You're bringing together very often things that don't fit in a way that creates the humor. And it's almost seeing something fit that you don't think is going to fit that makes the joke. So I think underlying that is that same thing, and that's the process of insight. That's the magic we're waiting for, is that connection. I think what I'm saying is, in order to make that magic happen, there's a lot of work that goes into it beforehand. The frustration, the planning, but also the sleeping on it is all helping it happen.
Would you say a lot of it is just inspiration? Is the initiative for it to happen? Or zone?
I think saying inspiration to me makes it a bit passive. It's like there's nothing I can do about it. And my feeling with creativity is there's a lot we can do to make it happen if we begin to see the process as it works in ourselves. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, maybe, how we can, by understanding the process in ourselves, work with it so as to encourage the inspiration to happen more often or more easily.
Listening to the discussion till now, I got an opinion that we have to point out something before we become confused, and that is most people are mixing creativity with ability of solving problems.
Yes.
And we did not say strong enough or underline strong enough that these are two different things. And what I would really like to ask you is, I heard you say more creative and less creative. Are there any mores and lesses in creativity?
It's a difficult question. I think, let's say some people seem to display more creativity in their life. There's an interesting study done several years ago in the United States where they took so-called creative people and so-called non-creative people. These were the people who appeared to be creative and those who didn't appear to be creative. And they looked at how good they were at actually coming up with new ideas. And they found that they were equally good, that the so-called non-creative people still had a lot of good ideas, but they tended to say, oh, I'm no good, that's just my thought, I'm not creative, I'll dismiss the thought. And so they didn't turn it into anything, they didn't write it down, they didn't produce anything. Whereas the creative person, so-called creative person, was somebody who said, here's an idea, let me follow it through and see what happens. So I think that's one difference. So I think creativity is intrinsic to all of us. I think we all have creativity, but we display it in different amounts and perhaps trust it differently. There's a wonderful line from an American writer called Emerson who says we should trust our own thoughts, because what often happens is we dismiss our thoughts and then tomorrow we hear somebody else, a complete stranger, say exactly what we have thought and they get all the credit for it. We think, hang on, I thought that yesterday. So I think part of it is learning to trust our own thoughts.
So it's like having the courage to follow vision, if I understood that right?
I think courage, yes, courage is definitely part of it. A courage to follow your vision. Well, first of all, I think, to trust your vision. To say, hang on, this is an idea, let me see. Maybe it doesn't work, maybe it does, but let me try it out. Not to dismiss it as silly. A lot of creative ideas seem silly when they start.
Excuse me, I got a feeling that we approached to a very dangerous field. Because you see, from childhood till old age, a person is somehow related to other people and their approval. And when we are talking about trusting ourselves and our ideas, does it mean that somebody has to trust his idea even if anybody else rejects it?
No, it doesn't mean that. Perhaps trust isn't the best word. Maybe what I'm saying is, let's not dismiss our ideas out of hand to begin with. When we have a new idea, let's not say this is stupid. Let's just explore it and test it. Now, it may turn out that we believe something and nobody else believes our idea. Then we have to look and say, are the other people right? Or maybe I'm right and they're wrong. That's a question we have to ask. But you see, that's the other part of creativity, is not just having the idea, it's testing it. Does it work? We have to test things to see if they work before we can apply them, or to see if they're valid or relevant.
Well,
so how do you see this process of testing?
It's partly really just taking the initial problem. When you have a problem or a situation, well, let's take the cake one. Let's take that. There you are, you're deciding in your mind how you might cut the cake, and you try it this way and you try it that way, and then you try some other way, and you test it. You say, well, hang on, I've got maybe 8 pieces, but they're not all the same shape or the same size, so it doesn't work. Or I used a curved slice, as you were trying to in your mind. That doesn't fit the initial conditions. That's the testing. It's saying, does my solution work? Does it satisfy the conditions?
who's setting up the conditions? Ourselves, the other, or we have to
Well,
be flexible?
I think the conditions are set by, I mean, in that situation I was setting the conditions. If you're sitting in a traffic jam and you want to get home and you want to find a new route home, you're probably setting the conditions. You're saying, I need to find a route that's going to get me home in, less time or without so much bother. So you're setting conditions. Sometimes they're external, sometimes they're internal. I think the important thing about creativity is seeing what we can do to work with the process. As I say, the first stage is what's often called preparation, which is the analysis stage, the thinking about the problem. And I think the commonest mistake there is not to give enough time to it. What we tend to do is we're so keen to get to a solution, we're so keen to solve the problem, to get rid of it, that we rush off with the first idea that comes to mind, and only later do we find those ideas aren't so good. So I think that's the first thing, is spending more time thinking about problems. I mean, sometimes when I'm working with people, I work with teams sometimes on creativity, I'll take a group away for 5 days, and I spend 3 days just thinking about the problem. They get very frustrated because they think by the second day they should have a solution. But it's that spending more and more time thinking about it leads to better solutions. So I think that's the first thing, is almost disciplining ourselves to take more time preparing. Then I think with the frustration, as we said earlier, frustration is part of the process. It happens nearly all the time. I mean, we forget that Einstein got frustrated. All the great creative people had periods of frustration. We think it shouldn't occur. I think when frustration occurs, we should say, well, here I am, I'm in that stage now, creativity. What is it telling me? I mean, I get this when I'm writing, I feel frustrated. And it's usually a sign that either I haven't been thinking clearly enough about what I'm trying to say, or I've got stuck in a certain way of doing it. And so the frustration is often a sign that either we need to step back and look at things in a new way, or see where we've got stuck.
Well, while you are talking about creativity and frustration, you always talk about frustration which appears when you cannot solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But is there something as a frustration somebody gets in when he has a creative idea? Because you see, to me, creativity still appears as a very dangerous business, because you must rely on approval of the others. And when you get the idea, you can't say, oh God, I'm starting getting ideas again.
You can get frustrated by having ideas.
Yes.
Well, I think what you've got into there is a second problem. I mean, that's the other thing about creativity. It isn't neat and tidy like this. We have a creative idea and we want to try it out. The next stage is a second problem, how to get other people to accept it, a completely new problem. So I may be frustrated now because I can't get you to understand a creative idea I've had, so maybe I should, begin to think of a new way of explaining it to you, or, a new way of communicating. So that's a different problem then. So I don't think it's the having the ideas which is frustrating. I think it's a creative person may put themselves in a new situation where they've got to find creative ways to communicate those ideas.
I thought of another source of frustration,
Mm-hmm.
and that's if society is really speeding up and accelerating right now, and there's more and more problems and challenges that face all of us. How is it possible that we can take the time to step back and focus more on the preparation stage of each problem that we encounter?
I think this is the paradox of creativity. We want to be more creative, faster, and this is the very time we need to make decisions faster, and yet the very time we need to be cool, calm, and collected. And there's that pressure to do things, and that I think requires a bit of self-discipline. And I find this difficult. I know on one level, the more time I take to think something out, the better the quality of the work, whether it's writing or whatever. But I also know that under pressure, I forget to do that. And I think one thing we can do is remind each other. We can continually help each other, say, hang on, slow down, take a bit more time. Let's just think about the problem more clearly.
Don't you think that we as humankind of this Western civilization as a whole should sometime also say, hey, let's slow down, because I think maybe we are pushing too hard for too much change and new ideas just for the sake of something new in the marketplace and so on.
I think that's absolutely true. I think you could say this whole creative process you could apply to society. And I think most of the time we don't take any time at all to think through where we're going. We have no plan for the future. We're continually dealing with problems as rapidly as possible. And I think you see this in politics and in business. People just want to come to a solution as quickly as possible. And it's often only 5 years later people realize if only we'd spent a bit more time thinking more clearly about the problem, then it would be easier. So yes, I think you're right. And also I think stepping back, the other part of the process is taking time off, what I call the incubation, the sleeping on it. And I think we don't do that in our society. We don't stop. We don't sort of say, let's take 6 months off, everybody. No more problem solving. We just stand still for 6 months. We can't do that. No. I think we can do that more in our individual lives. I mean, I always say to people, and I try to do this myself, with any big decision, is never to decide at that moment. Nearly always it can wait one day. I say, let me sleep on it, because often overnight you can see things differently. And even if a decision has to be made that day, you can say, well, can I call you back in 10 minutes? Let me just sleep on it for 10 minutes. It's a very important principle, never to rush, but just give the unconscious time.
Talking to people, one gets the impression that everybody is just creative enough, or let's say more than enough. But I believe that there could be people who, when alone at home, are thinking about themselves as not creative enough, and that frustrates them a great deal. So let me give you a straight question. Can it be learned?
Yes, I think it isn't creativity itself that can be learned. I think we are all creative. As I was saying, I think every moment of the day we're all here, all 5 of us, being creative the whole time in some way. Just in this conversation we are being creative. The question is not can we learn creativity, but can we learn to direct our creativity? Can we facilitate it? And I think things like realizing that taking time off, sleeping on something can improve creativity. Recognizing what we were talking about earlier, that the best ideas come not when we're trying hard, but when we're out walking the dog or having a bath. If we respect that in our life, then we maybe give more time in our life for those things to happen.
Yes, do you think that it has to do also with our left and the right side of the brain and the coordination between the two, or the balance between the two?
Yes, it's interesting. There's a lot of work been going on the last 10, 20 years to do with the left and right sides of the brain. And the general conclusion is that the left side seems a lot better at rational thinking, that sort of thinking, whereas the right side is much better at more intuitive, visual thinking. And I think creativity is actually bringing both sides together. We need to be rational at times, we need to think clearly, but we also need to be able to use imagery. And it's interesting that most creative people use a lot of imagery in their thinking. And I think the most famous case of this was the chemist Kekulé, who discovered the benzene ring. And the story is how he was sitting one day, he'd been trying to work out how you could put 6 carbon and 6 hydrogen atoms together to create a molecule. And he couldn't solve this problem. One day he was sitting in front of his fire, slightly drunk, so maybe alcohol helps at times. And suddenly he saw the flames going round in circles, and suddenly realized the structure wasn't a chain, which up until then, all the chemistry had been linear chains. He suddenly saw in his mind this circle. Now what is interesting there is somehow he must have known the idea himself originally. He knew that the solution was a circle, but all the time he was thinking with his left brain, all the time he was thinking logically, the idea couldn't break through. And it's only when he stopped and relaxed and went to this dozy state after a meal, as I say, with a couple of brandies, somehow the right brain could come through with an image, which actually was the solution. So I find this fascinating, and I think one of the things we can do is watch our images much more. Look at our dreams. I think very often the solutions to problems we're facing, they come up in our dreams. So I think we can look at our dreams or use imagery, the daydream, to really value daydreaming. Again, Einstein was great at daydreaming, and his ideas came up very often when he was just lying, daydreaming. So that's another thing we can do, is value using the right side of the brain to dream much more. So these are some of the things we can do, stepping back, taking more time, taking time off, valuing our frustration, all these things, daydreaming more, can all help this natural process, which is going on inside all of us all of the time. So it's not so much a question of how do we learn to become creative, but what can we do just to encourage this process to happen more easily. So in this program, we'll be looking really at how we can develop our creativity. In the next program, I want to look at how we can actually develop our stability, because in these times, I think we also need to become more stable as well as becoming more flexible. It's like we said, a tree in a storm. How does a tree both bend with the wind, and how does it make sure it stays still in the ground?